The empire built in a tent and lost in a palace. In 1747, a group of Afghan tribal chiefs gathered in a field near Kandahar to choose a new king. No palace, no throne, just men sitting in a circle in the open air, arguing about who should rule the most strategically positioned land between Persia, India, and Central Asia. The man they chose was 25 years old, had been a slave, and owned nothing. Within 9 years, his empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the gates of Delhi, and he carried in his possession the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the most famous jewel in human history, taken from the collapsed Persian Empire as a war prize. Archaeologists excavating battle sites at Panipat in northern India have found evidence of a single afternoon in 1761, when this empire's army killed more soldiers than Napoleon lost at Waterloo. One battle, one afternoon, the entire balance of power across South Asia shifted before sunset. Then, within one generation, it was gone. Not conquered, not destroyed by a foreign enemy. Eaten alive from the inside by 23 sons fighting over their father's throne. So how does the most powerful empire between Persia and India collapse in less time than it took to build? And why does Afghanistan still live inside that collapse today? To understand how the Durrani Empire was born, you need to understand what happened in Khorasan on the morning of June 19, 1747. Because on that morning, one of the most feared men in the world was murdered in his sleep, and the power he had accumulated over 30 years of warfare suddenly had nowhere to go. Nader Shah of Persia was not a man who inspired affection. He was a man who inspired terror, and he had built his empire entirely on that distinction. Born into poverty in northeastern Persia around 1688, he had risen through military service to become the effective ruler of Persia by 1736, formally taking the throne after deposing the last Safavid Shah. His military campaigns were the most successful in the Islamic world since Timur in the 15th century. He reconquered territories lost to the Ottoman Empire. He invaded Mughal India in 1739, sacked Delhi, and returned to Persia with looted wealth so vast that he suspended taxation across the entire Persian Empire for 3 years. Among the treasures he took from Delhi was the Peacock Throne, the most elaborate royal seat ever constructed, decorated with an estimated 26,500 precious stones, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a stone of approximately 186 carats, whose name means Mountain of Light in Persian. The Koh-i-Noor had passed through the hands of Mughal emperors for 2 centuries. Nader Shah took it in a single afternoon. By 1747, however, Nader Shah's reign had become a nightmare for everyone around him. His later campaigns had grown increasingly brutal, and his behavior toward his own commanders had become erratic and violent. He had blinded his own son on suspicion of conspiracy. He had ordered massacres in cities that resisted him. His officers lived in permanent fear that any morning might bring an accusation, a blinding, or an execution. On June 19, 1747, a group of his officers decided they would not wait to find out which of them was next. They entered his tent while he slept and killed him. The immediate consequence was the disintegration of everything Nader Shah had built. His empire had no institutional structure beyond his personal authority. There was no functioning bureaucracy, no established succession, no administrative framework that could survive the removal of the man at its center. Within weeks, the territories he had conquered were fragmenting as regional commanders declared independence. Tribal leaders reasserted authority, and the suppressed political energy of 3 decades of military autocracy exploded in every direction simultaneously. For the Afghan Pashtun tribes who had served in Nader Shah's army, this moment was both an opportunity and a crisis. They were armed, experienced, and suddenly leaderless in a strategic position. Between the collapsing Persian Empire to the west, the weakening Mughal Empire to the east, and the Central Asian trade routes to the north, that gave whoever could organize them quickly an extraordinary chance at power. What they needed was a leader, and they had a method for choosing one that was older than any of the empires collapsing around them. In the weeks following Nader Shah's assassination, the leaders of the major Pashtun tribes gathered near Kandahar for a loya jirga, a grand assembly, the traditional Afghan mechanism for making decisions that affected the entire tribal confederation. The jirga is not a democratic election in any modern sense. It is a consensus process in which tribal elders deliberate, argue, negotiate, and eventually reach an agreement that all parties can accept, even if none are entirely satisfied. The decisions it produces carry a legitimacy that no individual leader can claim by right of birth alone, because they represent the collective judgment of the community's most respected men. The gathering near Kandahar in 1747 deliberated for 9 days. The primary candidates were the leaders of the most powerful Pashtun tribes, men of established reputation, military experience, and existing followings. The most prominent was Ahmad Khan Abdali, who at approximately 25 years old was younger than most of the other candidates, but had served as a senior cavalry commander in Nader Shah's army and had demonstrated both military competence and a quality that the tribal elders valued more than martial skill: the capacity to be trusted by men who trusted no one. The historical sources on the jirga's deliberations are limited, but what the chroniclers of the period record is that the decision in Ahmad Khan's favor was not initially obvious. He lacked the age and established tribal authority of some other candidates. What tipped the balance, according to the Persian language chronicle Tariq-i-Ahmad Shahi, written by Mahmud al-Husseini in the 18th century, was the intervention of a prominent religious figure named Sabir Shah, who placed blades of wheatgrass in Ahmad Khan's turban, a symbolic act indicating divine endorsement of his leadership. Whether or not the story of the wheatgrass is literally true, it captures something important about how Ahmad Shah's legitimacy was constructed from the beginning. He was not king by right of blood. He was king by consensus, endorsed by religious authority, and therefore accountable to the community that had chosen him, in a way that purely hereditary monarchs were not required to be. This accountability, the understanding that his authority derived from performance rather than birth, shaped his governing style in ways that made the Durrani Empire's early decades its most successful. Ahmad Khan took the title Dur-i-Durran, Pearl of Pearls, and renamed both himself and his tribal confederation after it. He became Ahmad Shah Durrani. The empire took his name. And among the objects he brought from his service under Nader Shah was the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which he had acquired from the chaos following the assassination, and which he kept as a symbol of the authority that had passed to him from the ruins of Persia's greatness. The Koh-i-Noor's subsequent history is a thread that runs through the entire collapse of the Durrani legacy. It passed from Ahmad Shah to his successors, was fought over during the succession wars, eventually ended up in the possession of the Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh after the Durrani Empire lost control of the Punjab, and was finally taken by the British East India Company after the annexation of the Punjab in 1849. It now sits in the Tower of London as part of the Crown Jewels, and its ownership remains formally disputed by Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Iran. Afghanistan's geography is a paradox that has defeated every empire that has tried to hold it, and enriched every power that has used it as a corridor. Understanding why the Durrani Empire was possible at all requires understanding what the land itself provides, and what it demands in return. The territory that became the Durrani Empire's core sits at the intersection of three of the ancient world's most important geographic zones. To the west lies the Iranian Plateau, the heartland of Persian civilization, flat enough for agriculture and trade, but exposed to invasion from every direction. To the east lies the Indian subcontinent, the most densely populated and agriculturally productive region in Asia, protected by the Indus River system, but accessible through a limited number of mountain passes. To the north lie the steppes of Central Asia, the great grasslands from which Turkic, Mongol, and other nomadic peoples had launched repeated invasions southward for 2,000 years. Afghanistan itself is the mountain fastness between these zones, a territory dominated by the Hindu Kush mountain range, whose peaks exceed 7,000 meters, and the Pamir Plateau to the northeast. The passes through these mountains, the Khyber Pass, the Bolan Pass, the Salang Pass, are among the most strategically significant geographic features in Asian history. Every major land-based movement of armies, merchants, and populations between Central Asia and South Asia has passed through these corridors for 3 millennia. Kandahar, the city that Ahmad Shah chose as his first capital, sits at the southern end of this mountain system on a plateau approximately 1,000 meters above sea level, surrounded by agricultural land irrigated by the Arghandab River. Its position makes it the natural crossroads between routes leading north into the Hindu Kush, east through the Bolan Pass toward the Indus Valley, and west toward the Iranian Plateau. Control of Kandahar meant control of access to all three directions simultaneously. The Hari Rud and Helmand rivers provided irrigation for agricultural zones that could support significant populations and supply armies in the field. The trade routes that crossed Afghan territory carried some of the most valuable commodities moving between Asia and the Mediterranean world: silk, spices, lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, horses from the Central Asian steppes that were the most prized military animals in the subcontinent. Taxing this trade was the foundation of every Afghan state's finances before and after the Durrani Empire. What the geography also provided was defense. The mountains that made Afghanistan a corridor also made it a fortress. Armies entering the Hindu Kush from any direction faced supply lines stretching through narrow passes easily blocked by small defending forces, terrain that exhausted horses and men before they reached their objectives, and a population whose knowledge of the local geography gave them permanent tactical advantages over any invader. The Durrani Empire exploited this defensive geography masterfully during its peak years. Its successors discovered that the same geography that protected Afghanistan from conquest also trapped its internal conflicts within the mountains, amplifying every civil war into a catastrophe. Ahmad Shah Durrani built his empire with a speed that surprised everyone who watched it happen, and the methods he used reveal both his genuine political intelligence and the structural weaknesses that would eventually destroy what he created. His first priority was not conquest, but legitimacy. Before expanding his territory, he spent the first months of his reign consolidating authority over the Pashtun tribal confederation that had elected him. This meant a constant process of negotiation, reward, and demonstration. Visiting tribal leaders personally, resolving disputes, distributing the wealth he had accumulated during his service under Nader Shah, and establishing a reputation for keeping his promises that distinguished him sharply from his predecessor. The Persian chronicles of the period consistently describe Ahmad Shah as accessible in a way that Nader Shah had never been. A ruler who held open court, heard petitions from ordinary subjects, and responded to grievances personally rather than through intermediaries. The administrative system he built was pragmatic rather than ideological. He did not attempt to impose a uniform bureaucratic structure across all his territories, a task that would have been impossible given the diversity of tribal, urban, and agricultural communities under his authority. Instead, he worked with existing local power structures wherever they were functional, replacing them with direct imperial administration only where they had collapsed or were actively hostile. Provincial governors were generally drawn from local elites rather than imposed from Kandahar, which reduced resistance and maintained the local knowledge base that effective administration required. Taxation was organized around the existing agricultural and trade infrastructure, rather than restructured from the ground up. The revenue from the trade routes crossing Afghan territory was particularly significant. Caravans moving through the empire paid tariffs at established checkpoints, generating income that was more reliable than agricultural taxes and less dependent on the quality of any particular harvest. Ahmad Shah invested this revenue carefully, prioritizing military capability and infrastructure over personal luxury, a choice that contrasted sharply with the spending priorities of his successors. His military campaigns into the Punjab and Sindh in the early 1750s brought the most productive agricultural land in the northwestern subcontinent under Durrani control, dramatically expanding the empire's tax base and supply capacity. The Mughal Empire, which had nominally governed this territory, was too weak to resist effectively. Its central authority had fragmented after Nader Shah's devastating 1739 invasion, and the provincial governors who might have organized resistance were too preoccupied with competing against each other to coordinate against the Durrani threat from the northwest. By 1757, Ahmad Shah had raided and occupied Delhi itself, not for the first time, as he had previously sacked the city in 1757. Demonstrating that the Mughal capital was no longer capable of defending itself against a determined external force. He did not attempt to permanently occupy Delhi, recognizing that governing the vast Gangetic plain from Kandahar would stretch his administrative capacity beyond its limits. Instead, he extracted tribute and returned to Afghanistan, leaving behind a political vacuum that would define South Asian politics for the next decade. The Durrani military was built around a single, overwhelming advantage: the best light cavalry in Asia, operating in terrain its commanders understood better than any opponent they would ever face. Pashtun cavalry tactics had been refined over centuries of tribal warfare in Afghanistan's mountain and steppe environment. The standard Durrani cavalry unit operated on principles of speed, dispersion, and concentration, dispersing rapidly to avoid enemy fire or missile weapons, then concentrating with equal speed for a decisive charge at a moment of the commander's choosing. This tactical flexibility was the product of lifelong horsemanship and the decentralized command culture of tribal military organization, where individual fighters were expected to exercise judgment rather than simply follow orders mechanically. Ahmad Shah added to this tribal cavalry foundation the organizational sophistication he had absorbed during his years in Nader Shah's army, one of the most professionally organized military forces of the 18th century Islamic world. He introduced standardized supply arrangements that allowed his forces to operate over distances that would have been logistically impossible for purely tribal armies. He organized his cavalry into units of defined size with designated commanders, creating a chain of command that could function across the wide dispersal required by his operational style. And he incorporated artillery, cannon transported on camelback, and deployed rapidly during engagements, in a way that combined the mobility of his cavalry with the firepower that infantry-heavy opponents could not match in open terrain. The campaign against the Maratha Confederacy that culminated in the Third Battle of Panipat on January 14, 1761, was the Durrani Empire's greatest military achievement and one of the most consequential battles in South Asian history. The Marathas, a Hindu military confederation based in western India that had expanded dramatically to fill the power vacuum left by Mughal decline, had extended their control across much of northern India and were positioned to become the dominant power of the subcontinent. Their army at Panipat numbered approximately 45,000 cavalry and infantry, supported by artillery, and was accompanied by a civilian camp of perhaps 200,000 non-combatants, including merchants, pilgrims, and families of soldiers. Ahmad Shah's force was smaller but more mobile. The battle that developed on January 14th lasted approximately 8 hours. The Maratha cavalry initially pushed the Durrani centre back. Then Ahmad Shah committed his reserve cavalry, held back specifically for this moment, in a coordinated charge that struck the Maratha flanks simultaneously. The Maratha formation collapsed. The rout that followed was catastrophic. Historians estimate between 40,000 and 60,000 Maratha soldiers and camp followers killed, including the Maratha leader Vishwas Rao and his uncle Viswas Rao Peshwa's military commander Sadashiv Rao Bao. Archaeological surveys at the Panipat battlefield site conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India have identified mass burial sites consistent with the scale of casualties described in contemporary chronicles. The Third Battle of Panipat permanently ended Maratha ambitions to dominate northern India. It also permanently exhausted the Durrani Empire's capacity for large-scale offensive operations in the subcontinent, a fact that Ahmad Shah recognized, withdrawing his army to Afghanistan rather than attempting to consolidate control over northern India. The battle that demonstrated the Durrani Empire's military peak simultaneously marked the limit beyond which it could not expand. Ahmad Shah Durrani died in 1772 after 25 years as ruler of an empire stretching from eastern Persia to the Punjab, and from the Amu Darya River in the north to the Arabian Sea in the south. He was approximately 50 years old. The cause of his death, according to historical sources, was a progressive facial disease, probably a form of cancer affecting his nose and jaw, that had afflicted him for the last years of his life and that he managed, according to the chronicles, with a composure that his contemporaries found remarkable. What made Ahmad Shah's reign genuinely exceptional by the standards of his era was not the size of his empire or the victories of his army, both of which were impressive by any measure, but the quality of governance he maintained over a period of 25 years in a political environment that routinely destroyed rulers within years of their accession. The Afghan tribal system was not designed to support centralized authority. Its fundamental logic was egalitarian and deeply suspicious of any leader who accumulated too much personal power. Ahmad Shah navigated this tension with consistent skill, governing through consultation and consensus building rather than coercion wherever possible. His relationship with the non-Pashtun populations of his empire demonstrated a practical tolerance that was not universal among the rulers of his era. The Hindu merchant communities that operated the commercial networks of his cities were left largely undisturbed as long as they paid their taxes and did not challenge political authority. The Shia Muslim populations of his western territories, who might have expected hostility from a Sunni ruler, were generally governed through their existing community structures without imposed religious conformity. The Sikh communities of the Punjab were more complicated. Ahmad Shah raided the Golden Temple at Amritsar on multiple occasions, destroying the sacred pool and desecrating the shrine. But these actions appear to have been politically motivated responses to Sikh military resistance, rather than systematic religious persecution. The cultural output of the Durrani court at Kandahar and later Kabul reflected Ahmad Shah's personal interests as well as his political calculations. He was himself a poet who wrote in Pashto, a language that had very limited literary tradition before his patronage, composing verses that Persian and Pashto literary historians still study as foundational texts in the development of classical Pashto literature. His court attracted scholars, poets, and religious figures whose presence gave the empire a cultural legitimacy that purely military power could not have provided. The identity he constructed, Afghan, Pashtun, Muslim, imperial, was genuinely novel. Before Ahmad Shah, there had been no political entity that identified itself specifically as Afghan in the ethnic and cultural sense that the word carries today. He created that identity through the act of ruling, through the patronage of Pashto language and culture, and through the deliberate cultivation of a historical narrative that connected his empire to the ancient glory of the region's pre-Islamic kingdoms. The modern Afghan national anthem still contains references to the Durrani legacy, and Ahmad Shah is officially commemorated as the father of the Afghan nation, Baba-e-Afghanistan, in both Afghan historical tradition and modern political discourse. Ahmad Shah's death in 1772 did not immediately destroy the empire he had built. What it did was reveal how completely the empire's coherence had depended on his personal authority, and how inadequate the institutional structures he had created were for managing the succession crisis that every hereditary monarchy eventually faces. He was succeeded by his son Timur Shah, who moved the imperial capital from Kandahar to Kabul. This decision, which seemed at the time like a reasonable administrative choice, as Kabul's more central position made it easier to govern the empire's diverse northern and eastern territories, had consequences that the chroniclers of the period noted with the clarity of hindsight. Kandahar was the heartland of the Durrani tribal confederation, the city from which Ahmad Shah's authority had radiated outward, and the symbolic center of Pashtun political identity. Moving the capital to Kabul was, in the perception of the Durrani tribal elites, a distancing of the monarchy from its foundations, a first step toward becoming the kind of court-centered, Persian-influenced ruler that the Pashtun tribal tradition viewed with deep suspicion. Timur Shah ruled for 20 years, from 1772 to 1793, and the chronicles of his reign describe a ruler whose personal qualities were adequate, but whose political instincts were consistently misaligned with the requirements of his position. He preferred the pleasures of his court to the exhausting work of tribal politics. He relied increasingly on non-Pashtun advisors, Kizilbash cavalry commanders of Turkic origin, who had served the Safavid and Durrani courts for generations, whose competence was genuine, but whose authority over Pashtun tribal leaders was minimal. The result was a slow erosion of the personal relationships between the monarchy and the tribal confederation that had been the Durrani Empire's political foundation. The demographic reality of Timur Shah's personal life became the empire's political catastrophe. He had, by the count maintained in the Persian chronicles of the period, 23 sons by multiple wives and concubines. Each of these sons represented a potential claimant to the throne. Each was connected to different tribal and factional networks within the empire, and none of them had been designated with sufficient clarity as the intended successor to preempt the competition that would inevitably follow Timur Shah's death. When Timur Shah died in 1793, the succession crisis began almost immediately. His fifth son, Zaman Shah, initially prevailed and ruled for 7 years. But Zaman Shah's reign was marked by continuous threats from his brothers, multiple coup attempts, and the growing involvement of external powers, particularly the British East India Company, which had developed interests in Afghan political stability as a buffer against potential Russian expansion toward India, and the Qajar dynasty of Persia, which had its own territorial ambitions in the western Afghan provinces. In 1800, Zaman Shah was deposed and blinded by his brother Mahmud Shah, who in turn was deposed and replaced by another brother, Shuja Shah, in 1803. The pattern would repeat with variations for the next quarter century, each cycle of deposition and replacement weakening the central authority further, exhausting the loyalty of tribal leaders who had backed losing claimants, and inviting greater external interference in Afghan affairs. The cities of the Durrani Empire were not the monumental urban centers of the Persian or Mughal traditions. Massive planned capitals built to express imperial grandeur through sheer scale. They were more intimate places, shaped by the intersection of trade, tribal politics, and Islamic scholarship, and their architecture reflected the pragmatic culture of a dynasty whose roots were in the open countryside rather than the palace. Kandahar under Ahmad Shah was the political and commercial capital of a trading network stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Asian steppes. Its bazaars, the covered market streets that were the commercial heart of every major Islamic city, handled goods moving in both directions along the routes that crossed Afghan territory. Indian cotton textiles, spices and sugar moved westward and northward through Kandahar's markets. Central Asian horses, furs, and dried fruits moved southward and eastward. The revenue from taxing this trade, collected at the city's customs posts, funded the imperial administration and the military campaigns that kept the trade routes open. The Friday Mosque of Kandahar, the Masjid-e-Jami, was rebuilt and expanded under Ahmad Shah's patronage and became the spiritual center of the empire's public religious life. Ahmad Shah's own tomb, constructed adjacent to the mosque after his death in 1772, was designed as a statement of the dynasty's religious legitimacy. A physical connection between the ruling family and the sacred geography of Islamic devotion that served the same political function as the great dynastic tombs of the Mughal emperors in Delhi and Agra. Kabul, after Timur Shah moved the capital there in the 1770s, developed rapidly as an administrative center. Its position in a high mountain valley made it both defensible and climatically distinct from Kandahar. Cooler summers, colder winters, and a surrounding agricultural zone capable of supporting a significant urban population. The city's gardens, including the Ba-e-Babur, the garden tomb of the Mughal founder Babur that had existed since the 16th century, gave Kabul a reputation for physical beauty that Persian-language travelers consistently noted in their accounts. The bazaar culture of both cities was the daily texture of empire for most of the people who lived within its reach. The markets were not simply commercial spaces. They were information networks, social institutions, and political barometers simultaneously. The prices of grain and cloth in Kandahar's bazaars reflected the security of the trade routes from India. The conversations in Kabul's tea houses tracked the movements of tribal armies and the shifting alliances of rival princes with an accuracy that no official intelligence service could have matched. When the empire began to collapse, the bazaars registered the decline before the court did, in rising prices, in the disappearance of certain luxury goods as trade routes became unsafe, in the faces of merchants who were packing their most valuable stock for rapid departure. The Durrani Empire operated within two overlapping legal and moral frameworks, Islamic law and Pashtunwali, that were sometimes complementary and sometimes in direct tension, and whose relationship shaped every aspect of political and social life within the empire's Pashtun core. Pashtunwali is the customary code of the Pashtun tribes, a a set of behavioral obligations governing honor, hospitality, revenge, and collective responsibility that predates Islam in the region, and that has survived into the contemporary world with remarkable consistency. Its core obligations include melmastia, unconditional hospitality to any guest, regardless of the host's resources or the guest's identity. Nanawatai, the obligation to grant asylum to anyone who seeks it, even a blood enemy. Badal, the requirement to seek revenge for any insult or injury to oneself or one's family. And Nang, the defense of personal and collective honor at any cost. These obligations created specific political dynamics within the Durrani Empire that Ahmad Shah understood and managed skillfully. The hospitality obligation meant that a tribal leader who received an imperial envoy was bound to treat that envoy with courtesy and safety, which gave Ahmad Shah a mechanism for communication and negotiation with potentially hostile tribal leaders that did not depend on military intimidation. The asylum obligation meant that a defeated or exiled rival who sought refuge with a tribal leader could not be handed over without destroying that leader's honor, which complicated the suppression of political opposition, but also, paradoxically, reduced the stakes of political defeat in ways that made compromise possible. Islamic law, the Sharia as interpreted through the Hanafi school that predominated in the region, provided the formal legal framework for property disputes, inheritance, marriage, commercial contracts, and criminal cases in the empire's urban centers and in communities with established Qazi courts. Ahmad Shah's court maintained Islamic legal forms scrupulously, ensuring that his policies were endorsed by religious scholars whose approval gave them legitimacy in the eyes of the empire's Muslim population. His claim to the title Dur-i-Duran was accompanied by a claim to the role of defender of Sunni Islam, a political positioning that connected his empire to the broader Islamic political tradition and differentiated it from the Shia Persian dynasty to his west. The tension between Pashtunwali and Islamic law was most acute in the area of women's rights and family governance. Islamic law granted women inheritance rights, divorce rights, and property ownership in ways that the more restrictive Pashtunwali tradition often effectively denied in practice. The resolution of this tension was typically local rather than imperial. Different communities applied different balances depending on the relative strength of religious scholars and tribal elders in their specific context. The imperial government in Kandahar and Kabul generally avoided intervening in these local arrangements, which reduced political friction at the cost of consistent legal application across the empire. The Durrani Empire's economic foundation was the trade network that crossed its territory, and the military capacity to keep that network functioning was simultaneously the empire's primary source of revenue and its most expensive ongoing commitment. The routes crossing Afghan territory in the 18th century were among the most valuable commercial corridors in the world, carrying goods whose aggregate value is difficult to estimate, but whose importance to the economies of India, Persia, Central Asia, and ultimately Europe was significant. Indian cotton textiles, particularly the fine muslins of Bengal and the printed cottons of Gujarat, moved northward and westward through Afghan bazaars to Persian and Central Asian markets. Horses from the Uzbek and Turkmen steppelands, the finest cavalry animals available in Asia, whose quality was a function of the Central Asian grassland environment that could not be replicated in the subcontinent, moved southward toward the Indian armies that depended on them. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan provided the brilliant blue pigment that colored the paintings of Renaissance Italy and Mughal India alike. The Durrani imperial administration's approach to trade regulation was pragmatic. Caravans paid tariffs at established checkpoints in return for imperial protection, an arrangement that worked as long as the empire could actually deliver the security it promised. When succession crises weakened central authority and allowed tribal raiding of trade routes to resume, the tariff system collapsed because merchants who were being raided stopped paying for protection they were not receiving. The decline of trade revenue during the succession wars after 1793 accelerated the empire's financial deterioration in a feedback loop that no individual ruler had the resources to interrupt. Weapons technology was one area where the Durrani military actively sought to maintain parity with its opponents. The matchlock muskets that had been the standard infantry firearm of the region were gradually supplemented with flintlock weapons acquired through trade and manufacture during the 18th century. Artillery, which Ahmad Shah had used effectively at Panipat, was maintained and expanded as a core component of the empire's military capability. Afghan craftsmen in the Khyber Pass region developed a tradition of firearms manufacturing that would eventually make the region one of the world's most productive centers of small arms production, a tradition that continues in the tribal areas of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border today. The communication system that held the empire together was based entirely on mounted messengers, riders who carried written dispatches on the major roads connecting Kandahar, Kabul, Peshawar, and the provincial capitals. The speed of this system, approximately 150 to 200 kilometers per day on good roads under optimal conditions, was broadly comparable to communication speeds in other pre-telegraph empires of the period. It was fast enough to coordinate military responses to threats that developed over weeks, but too slow for the kind of rapid political crisis management that the succession wars of the post-Ahmad Shah period increasingly required. The collapse of the Durrani Empire was not a military defeat. No foreign army conquered Kandahar or Kabul. No external power imposed a peace treaty that stripped the empire of its territories. What destroyed the Durrani Empire was a family, specifically the inability of Ahmad Shah's descendants to maintain the political relationships that his authority had held together, and the willingness of each successive claimant to destroy those relationships completely rather than share the power that was already insufficient to hold the empire intact. The 23 sons of Timur Shah were not individually monstrous. Most of them were men of ordinary abilities placed in an extraordinary situation, competing for the throne of an empire whose institutional structures had never been designed to manage a contested succession. The Durrani political system had no mechanism for choosing an heir short of the founder's personal designation, no tradition of primogeniture that could settle the question by birth order, and no institutional counterweight, no Senate, no Council of State, no religious authority with genuine independent power that could arbitrate between competing claimants. Zaman Shah, who initially prevailed after Timur Shah's death in 1793, attempted to consolidate his authority by eliminating the most dangerous of his brothers, a standard enough response in the political environment he inhabited. But each elimination created new enemies among the tribal networks connected to the eliminated brother, and each new enemy created new alliances that previous enemies could exploit. The Barakzai clan, a Pashtun tribal group whose members had served the Durrani dynasty as military commanders and administrators, began to emerge as a power behind the throne, playing rival Sadazai princes against each other and accumulating the real administrative and military authority that the distracted princes were too busy fighting each other to retain. The Barakzai chief, Fateh Khan, who served successive Durrani princes as wazir, chief minister, from approximately 1800 onward, was the most significant political figure of the empire's final decades. He was genuinely capable. The chronicles of the period describe him as the last man who might have stabilized the empire by imposing order on the succession crisis through sheer political skill. He supported and deposed successive Sadazai princes, depending on which alliance served his current political needs, accumulating power that made him indispensable and dangerous simultaneously. In 1818, the Durrani prince Mahmud Shah, whom Fateh Khan had helped restore to the throne, ordered Fateh Khan's execution, reportedly motivated by the discovery that Fateh Khan had humiliated a member of the royal family during a military campaign. The execution was carried out with deliberate brutality. Fateh Khan was blinded first, then mutilated over several days before being killed in front of his brothers. The message was intended as a demonstration of royal authority. Its actual effect was the opposite. Fateh Khan's 20 brothers, each commanding significant tribal followings, launched simultaneous rebellions across every province of the empire. Within 8 years, they had carved the Durrani Empire into the separate principalities that they controlled. The last Sadazai claimant was driven from Kabul in 1826. The Durrani Empire, as a unified political entity, ceased to exist. At its maximum extent under Ahmad Shah, the Durrani Empire covered approximately 2.5 million square kilometers, a territory comparable in size to the modern states of Saudi Arabia and Iran combined. From the Amu Darya River in the north to the Arabian seacoast of Baluchistan in the south, from the border of the Persian Khorasan province in the west to the Yamuna River east of Delhi in the east, no single political authority had governed this geographic space before Ahmad Shah, and none has done so since. The military force that held this territory together was organized around a permanent cavalry establishment of approximately 12,000 to 15,000 elite horsemen, the Ghulam-i-Shah, or Royal Cavalry, supplemented by tribal levies that could expand the army to 60,000 or more from major campaigns. The quality of the core cavalry was exceptional by the standards of the era. Well-equipped, well-mounted, and experienced in the specific tactical environment of the Afghan highlands and the Indian plains. At Panipat in 1761, this force had demonstrated that it could defeat a numerically superior and well-organized opponent in open battle, a capability that made it the most feared military instrument in the region between Persia and Bengal. The treasure accumulated through 2 decades of successful campaigning was enormous by the standards of the 18th century Islamic world. The loot from Delhi alone, taken on multiple campaigns, included not only portable wealth in the form of gold, silver, and jewels, but also skilled craftsmen, artisans, and scholars whom Ahmad Shah brought to Kandahar to enhance his court's cultural and technical capabilities. The Koh-i-Noor, the throne room furnishings of the Mughal court, and a collection of manuscripts from the Imperial Library were among the cultural treasures that passed through Kandahar during this period. The diplomatic recognition that the Durrani Empire received from its contemporaries reflected the reality of its power. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful Sunni state in the world, corresponded with Ahmad Shah as an equal. The Mughal emperor in Delhi, nominal sovereign of the subcontinent, accepted tributary status. The Qajar dynasty that replaced the Afsharid dynasty in Persia after Nader Shah's assassination treated the Durrani Empire as the primary power to its east, and managed the border between them through negotiation rather than confrontation. Even the British East India Company, in the early decades of its expansion across the Indian subcontinent, regarded the Durrani Empire as a significant power whose attitude toward British activities needed to be managed carefully. What the peak concealed was the absence of any institutional mechanism for sustaining it. The empire's prosperity was Ahmad Shah's prosperity, held together by his personal relationships, his military reputation, his consistent delivery on the obligations of patronage, and the specific political intelligence that could not be transferred by inheritance. The structure he had built was a house of alliances, not a house of institutions. When the man who had built those alliances was gone, the alliances did not outlast him by very long. The financial collapse of the Durrani Empire in its final decades followed a pattern that historians of imperial decline recognize from other contexts. But the speed with which it unfolded in the Afghan case was exceptional, even by the compressed timescales of 18th century political life. The core problem was straightforward. The empire's revenue base had been built on two sources: trade tariffs and tribute from conquered territories, both of which required continuous military capacity to maintain. When the succession wars of the post-Timur Shah period began consuming military resources in internal conflict, rather than external projection, both revenue sources contracted simultaneously. Trade routes became unsafe as central authority weakened, reducing tariff income. Tributary territories whose continued payment had depended on the credible threat of Durrani military response began defaulting as that threat became less credible. The Punjab, which had been the most valuable tributary territory and the primary source of agricultural surplus for the empire, began slipping from Durrani control in the early 19th century under pressure from the expanding Sikh confederacy led by Ranjit Singh. Ranjit Singh was, in the early 19th century, the most capable ruler in the northwestern subcontinent. A military and political genius who consolidated the Sikh confederacy into a professional army state capable of challenging the Durrani Empire directly. His gradual annexation of the Punjab between approximately 1800 and 1820 was systematic rather than dramatic. He absorbed one district at a time, negotiating where possible and fighting where necessary, never giving the fragmented Durrani political system a single clear provocation that might have united its competing factions against him. By 1820, the Punjab was effectively lost, and with it, the agricultural and commercial revenue that had funded Durrani military campaigns since Ahmad Shah's time. The involvement of external powers added a further layer of instability to a situation already beyond the management capacity of the succession-weakened central government. The British East India Company, whose presence in India had expanded dramatically since the 1750s, had developed a strategic interest in Afghan political arrangements as the buffer zone between its Indian possessions and the potential threat of Russian expansion southward through Central Asia. British agents operating from the company's stations in northern India provided financial and political support to whichever Durrani claimant seemed most likely to maintain a stable, Britain-friendly government. A policy that, in practice, meant intervening in every succession dispute and ensuring that no claimant was ever secure enough to stop being dependent on British support. The corruption that spread through the administrative system during the succession wars was partly cause and partly symptom of the empire's decline. Provincial governors who had no confidence in the longevity of the prince they served extracted as much revenue as possible, as quickly as possible, rather than investing in the infrastructure maintenance and local political relationships that sustainable governance required. Soldiers who had not been paid reliably for months supplemented their incomes through the kind of predatory taxation and extortion that distinguished an occupying army from a legitimate security force. The distinction between the empire's administration and organized banditry became increasingly difficult to maintain in the provinces. The end of the Durrani Empire as a unified political entity came in 1826 with the deposition of its last Sadrzai ruler from Kabul. But the process of disintegration had been so gradual and so complete by that point that the formal end was almost anticlimactic. The empire had already fragmented into a collection of competing principalities years before anyone acknowledged that the central authority was gone. The Barakzai brothers, the sons and relatives of Fateh Khan, whose brutal execution in 1818 had triggered the final wave of rebellions, divided the former empire's territory among themselves with a brutal pragmatism that mirrored the process by which the empire had originally been assembled. Dost Muhammad Khan, the most capable of the Barakzai brothers, eventually established himself as the dominant power in Kabul and its surrounding territories, becoming the founder of what would become the Barakzai dynasty that governed Afghanistan until 1978. But his authority in the early years extended little beyond the territories he could physically control with his own troops. The empire's integrated administrative and military system had been destroyed beyond recovery. The territories that had been the most productive parts of the Durrani Empire at its peak were now controlled by powers that had no connection to the Durrani legacy. Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire held the Punjab. The Qajar dynasty of Persia had recovered the western Afghan provinces of Herat and its surrounding territory. Sindh was controlled by the Talpur Mirs, who had established independence from Kabul decades earlier. Baluchistan operated under local tribal authority that acknowledged neither Kabul nor any other external power. The empire that had connected these regions was not a memory. It was barely a concept. The people living in the former empire's territory experienced its absence as a change in which armed men collected their taxes and which flags flew from the local fortress, not as the loss of a civilization. The civilian population had absorbed the consequences of the succession wars in the most direct possible way. Through the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, the disruption of trade that had provided employment and access to goods, the military recruitment, forced or voluntary, that removed men from productive activity, and the general insecurity that made long-term investment in land improvement or commercial expansion irrational. The chronicles of travelers passing through Afghan territory in the 1810s and 1820s consistently describe a landscape of depopulated villages, abandoned irrigation channels, and roads empty of the merchant caravans that had been their defining feature a generation earlier. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, which had symbolized the Durrani Empire's claim to greatness since Ahmad Shah acquired it from the ruins of Nader Shah's treasury, passed with the Punjab to Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire after the Durrani loss of Lahore. When the British East India Company annexed the Punjab in 1849, following the Second Anglo-Sikh War, the Koh-i-Noor was included in the terms of annexation and transferred to the British Crown. Queen Victoria received it in 1850 and had it recut from its original 186 carats to its current 105.6 carats to improve its brilliance. It has remained in British possession ever since, and the question of its rightful ownership continues to generate diplomatic friction between Britain and multiple South Asian governments to the present day. The Durrani Empire lasted 79 years, less than a human lifetime. And yet its legacy has shaped the politics, identity, and conflicts of the region it governed, continuously from 1747 to the present day, in ways that are often not recognized precisely, because they are so fundamental to the current situation that they appear to be simply the natural condition of things, rather than the product of specific historical choices made in specific circumstances. The most direct legacy is the border. Modern Afghanistan's territory, its specific shape on the map, the particular combination of ethnic, linguistic, and geographic communities it contains, is the direct inheritance of what remained after the Durrani Empire's dissolution, and after the subsequent Anglo-Afghan wars of the 19th century, drew the Durrani Line in 1893, separating British India from Afghan territory in a manner that cut across Pashtun tribal territories in ways whose political consequences have not been resolved in the 130 years since. The modern states of Afghanistan and Pakistan both contain large Pashtun populations on either side of a border that neither the people living near it nor most Afghan and Pakistani governments have ever accepted as legitimate. This unresolved territorial question is a direct product of the Durrani Empire's collapse and the subsequent British management of its aftermath. The ethnic and political identity of the Pashtun people, the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan and the second largest in Pakistan, was crystallized in its modern form during the Durrani period. Before Ahmad Shah, Pashtun identity was primarily tribal. A person was a member of the Abdali or Ghilzai or Yusufzai confederation, not an Afghan in any meaningful political sense. Ahmad Shah's empire created the political category of Afghan as a supra-tribal identity, an identity that survived the empire's collapse because it had become attached to a territory, a language, and a set of cultural practices that persisted regardless of who governed Kabul. The Barakzai dynasty that replaced the Sadozai Durranis as the governing power in Afghanistan ruled, with interruptions, until 1978, when a communist coup ended monarchical government entirely. The last Afghan king, Muhammad Zahir Shah, was a Barakzai. The direct line from the power politics of the 1820s to the political structure of the 20th century is continuous and traceable. Genetic and genealogical research conducted in collaboration with Afghan diaspora communities in the United States and Europe has confirmed the deep continuity of tribal identity across the 2.5 centuries since the Durrani Empire's foundation. Studies published in the American Journal of Human Genetics and related publications have identified genetic markers that correspond closely to the traditional tribal divisions recorded in the historical chronicles: Abdali, Ghilzai, Yusufzai, Barakzai, demonstrating that the tribal communities Ahmad Shah organized into an empire have maintained their distinct identities across generations of conflict, displacement, and migration. The lesson that the Durrani Empire most clearly teaches is one that applies to every political system built around a single extraordinary individual rather than durable institutions. Ahmad Shah's personal qualities, his political intelligence, his military skill, his capacity for consensus building, his understanding of the tribal dynamics he was navigating, were genuine and exceptional. They built something real, but they could not be inherited. The institutional structures that might have sustained his empire in his absence, a clear succession mechanism, a professional administrative corps with loyalty to the state rather than to individual rulers, a legal framework that could arbitrate disputes without resort to violence, were never fully developed, partly because developing them would have required Ahmad Shah to constrain his own authority in ways that felt unnecessary during years of success. Every generation of Afghans since 1826 has lived inside the collapse of the Durrani Empire, in the borders it left, in the tribal politics it crystallized, in the external interference it invited by its weakness, and in the memory of a moment when the territory we now call Afghanistan was the center of something genuinely powerful. That memory persists, in the shrines, in the poetry, in the genealogies that Afghan families maintain across centuries of disruption. Ahmad Shah Durrani is buried in Kandahar, in a tomb adjacent to the mosque, where a cloak believed to have belonged to the Prophet Muhammad is preserved as a sacred relic. The tomb was damaged, fighting multiple times during the conflicts of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and restored multiple times. It is still there. The empire is gone. The question it leaves is still being answered. How do you build something that outlasts the man who built it? In a land where every mountain pass reminds you that nothing lasts forever, and every generation must prove its right to exist from the beginning. There is one more thing worth saying before this story ends. The Durrani Empire's collapse was not unique in its causes. Succession crises have destroyed dynasties across every civilization and every century. Corruption hollows out administrations in every era. External powers exploit internal weakness in every political environment. These are not Afghan problems. They are human problems. What makes the Durrani case distinctive is the speed. Ahmad Shah built his empire in approximately 5 years, from the Jirga of 1747 to the full extension of Durrani authority across the Punjab and Sindh by 1752. He maintained it for 20 years through skill and personal authority. And it was effectively gone within 50 years of his death, dismantled by his own grandchildren before any external power had applied serious military pressure. The speed of the collapse reflects the absence of institutional depth. Rome took centuries to fall because its institutions, its legal system, its administrative bureaucracy, its military professional culture, had accumulated enough resilience to absorb repeated political shocks. The Durrani Empire had brilliant founders and terrible institutions. When the founders died, there was nothing beneath them to hold the structure up. The British officers who began systematic study of Afghan history in the early 19th century, preparing for what would become the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839 to 1842, were struck by this pattern. They commissioned translations of the Persian chronicles, interviewed survivors of the Durrani court, and attempted to map the tribal power structures that had replaced the empire's administrative framework. What they produced was one of the most detailed records of an empire's dissolution available for any pre-modern Asian state. And what those records showed was that the people living in former Durrani territory had not simply forgotten the empire. They had incorporated its memory into their political identity in ways that made both cooperation and conflict with any future authority deeply entangled with the question of what the Durrani legacy meant and who had the right to claim it. That entanglement has never been fully resolved. The Taliban, which emerged from the Pashtun tribal areas of southern Afghanistan and drew its initial support base from the Kandahar region, Ahmad Shah's original capital, operated with a self-consciousness about Durrani history that was not always visible in Western coverage of their movement. The symbolism of Kandahar as the spiritual and political center of legitimate Afghan authority, the invocation of the lawyer Jirga as a mechanism of political legitimacy, the use of the cloak of the prophet preserved in Kandahar as a symbol of religious endorsement for political leadership. All of these are Durrani-era symbols being used in 21st century political contests. The Koh-i-Noor sits in London. Ahmad Shah's tomb has been rebuilt. The trade routes that funded the empire now carry different goods and are contested by different powers. But the fundamental political question that the Durrani Empire raised and never answered: how do you build lasting authority in a land where the mountains outlast every empire and every generation must earn its own legitimacy from the beginning, remains as open today as it was when a group of tribal elders placed wheatgrass in a young man's turban and told him he was king. History does not repeat, but it rhymes with a precision that should make us pay attention. The Durrani Empire was built in a tent. It was lost in a palace, and everything in between. The battles, the poetry, the betrayals, the diamonds, the mountains, is a story about what happens when human ambition runs ahead of human wisdom, and what gets left behind when the ambition is gone. That is the story of the Durrani Empire. and the story is not over. The Third Battle of Panipat in January 1761 deserves a closer look than any summary can provide, because it was not simply a military event. It was the moment that determined the political trajectory of South Asia for the next century, and its consequences are still visible in the religious and ethnic geography of the subcontinent today. The Maratha Confederacy that Ahmad Shah destroyed at Panipat had, in the 15 years before the battle, expanded from its base in western India to establish effective control over large portions of northern, central, and eastern India. Maratha revenue collectors were operating in Bengal. Maratha armies had twice occupied Delhi. The Mughal emperor was, in practice, a Maratha client. Had the Marathas continued on their trajectory, the most plausible outcome for South Asia in the second half of the 18th century was the emergence of a Maratha-dominated Indian state that would have been the primary power the British East India Company confronted as it attempted to expand beyond Bengal. Panipat ended that trajectory completely. The Maratha military leadership was killed. The Maratha financial and logistical system was destroyed, along with the army. The recovery took decades, and the Marathas never regained the momentum or the territorial position they had held in 1760. The political vacuum that their defeat created was filled, over the following decades, primarily by the British, who expanded from Bengal into the Gangetic Plain and eventually across the entire subcontinent at a pace and with a completeness that would almost certainly have been impossible if they had faced a unified Maratha state, rather than the fragmented successor polities that Panipat left behind. Ahmad Shah, in destroying the Marathas at Panipat, did not intend to clear the path for British dominance of India. He intended to establish Durrani supremacy in northern India and return to Afghanistan. That is what he did. But the indirect consequences of his victory, the permanent weakening of the only Indian power strong enough to have checked British expansion, shaped the history of the subcontinent for 200 years. This is how historical causation actually works. Not through the intentions of the people making decisions, but through the cascading consequences of those decisions in systems too complex for any individual to fully anticipate. Ahmad Shah could not have known that his victory at Panipat would contribute to conditions that eventually produced British India. The British officers who studied his campaigns a generation later did not fully appreciate that their own presence in India was partly a consequence of his military genius. History moves through these oblique connections, through the gaps between intention and outcome, through the spaces where one civilization's strength creates another civilization's opportunity. The Durrani Empire's story is full of these oblique connections. The empire that was born from the assassination of Nader Shah contributed, through its own internal collapse, to the conditions that made the great game between Britain and Russia the defining strategic contest of 19th century Asia. The tribal structures that Ahmad Shah organized into an empire proved more durable than the empire itself, and those tribal structures shaped the context in which the Soviet invasion of 1979, the subsequent civil wars, and the American presence after 2001 all unfolded. The mountains do not change, the passes do not change, and the fundamental political dynamics of a territory where every external power has eventually discovered that it can enter but cannot stay. Those do not change either. What does change is the names of the empires that learn this lesson the hard way. The Durrani learned it from within. The British learned it 3 times, in 1842, 1880, and 1919. The Soviets learned it between 1979 and 1989. The Americans are learning it still. The land that made the Durrani Empire possible is still there. The lesson it teaches has not changed in 3,000 years of recorded history. Whether anyone is listening is, as always, a different question.